Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History 5 podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Dennis MacDonald. And today we're going to be discussing his new book titled The Feuding Gospels. That being said, Dennis, thank you for joining me today. And can you tell the audience a little bit about what your new book is about?
Yeah, the title actually is Feuding Gospel Authors. And it sounds like old hat. There are how many books, Jacob, that are written on how the Gospels differ from each other. But this is a very different kind of book. You won't find anything like it anywhere. The subtitle is as important as the title. The subtitle is Apocryphal Epistles Clashing Over Imitations of Homer, Euripides, Virgil, and Plato. And what makes it different is a different methodology from what we usually understand to be intertextual issues among the Gospels, namely redaction. Redaction is a modern word. The ancient Greek word for this project is paraphrasis, where we get our word paraphrase. So it's the use of an earlier text that is similar in content, but then in the later text is altered, either for theological reasons or for literary reasons or for political reasons. And the trick in paraphrasis is to determine which is the earlier of the two books, which is the earliest form of a saying of Jesus, for example. And the synoptic problem is still unsettled in large measure because people disagree about what is the model and what is the imitator or the redactor. Now, paraphrasis was taught by Greek rhetoricians, and they knew how to talk about it in terms of additions, subtractions, rearrangements, doublets. They talk about conflations, where you have two versions of something that get merged into something else. And this book, Feuding Gospel Authors, describes how rhetorical teachers taught people to do this rephrasing. But it's not the most important thing that they taught about intertextuality. What much more important to them, and it's clear in literature, was something that they called mimesis, and we would call literary imitation. And mimesis was so important because it allowed for the training of lawyers who are going to use their rhetoric in court to talk about who was a better person than your client's better than the opponent's client, for example. Now, the way mimesis worked, and this is going to be a little technical, Jacob, but I think it's really important for understanding what this book is about. Mimesis is really quite simple. You start by identifying a typos, that is a model, sometimes called a paradigm. And so you find, for example, a story about a shipwreck. And so you're going to rewrite the shipwreck of Odysseus in Odyssey, Book 5. The next thing that you need to do is to establish similarities between that story and the story you're writing, so people understand that it's advertised imitation. People understand that you are writing an alternative shipwreck story. The next thing that you do then is establish a syncresis, a comparison between Odysseus and your hero who went through a shipwreck. And syncresis comes in several forms. It can be either a double encomium, that is, both characters are virtuous. Odysseus is virtuous and your hero is virtuous. Or you can say that Odysseus is good, but your hero is actually better because he survives the shipwreck. Another is a double invective. That is, the character in your story is bad, the one you chose, and you're going to have a villain in your account as well. But the more common one is to pick a typos and to have a hero who has trouble or is causing trouble. That's the bad part. And the story that you're telling is the good part. So that's an encomium for your person, but an invective for the other. And this was taught routinely, apparently, for centuries in the training of lawyers. Now, it's this mimesis that is missing in most of gospel scholarship. When it appears in the form of imitation of the Jewish Bible. So occasionally, especially in Luke, Jesus is similar to Elijah. Or in Matthew, sometimes Jesus is similar to Moses. The same thing happens with David in certain cases. So you have this comparison. And most of the time, it's Moses is good, but Jesus is better, something like that. Now, once one takes account, though, of the Gospels within Greek literature, it's clear that they're not just limiting themselves to imitations of Jewish texts, but also of Greek texts. And in some cases, actually a Latin text, that is Virgil's Aeneid. And that's what makes this project different. These gospel authors, in my view, are, I'm putting words into their mouths, but they're discussing how the other gospel authors are using mimesis to describe Jesus or Paul or whatever. One of the advantages, Jacob, of mimesis is it solves clearly the sequence of the Gospels. And in this book, I don't limit myself only to the 4 canonical Gospels. So let me list the ones that I do use, and I'll put them in chronological order. The Q document, which I reconstruct and call instead by its most likely original name, the Logoi, or sayings of Jesus. Then comes Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, who knows those 3 earlier Gospels. In between Matthew and Luke is Papias's exposition of Logia about the Lord. So then we have Mark, Matthew, Papias, and Luke Acts. Then we have the Gospel of John in 3 different stages of composition. Then the Gospel of Thomas. And the last one that I treat is the Gospel of Marcion and its relationship to the Gospel of Luke. So whereas other treatments of synoptic intertextuality or gospel intertextuality more generally is about redaction or prophesis, what this book is talking about is the mimesis not only of Jewish texts, but also of Greco-Roman texts. Now, in order to identify mimesis, we have to set up some criteria because it is not native to us to understand how these texts are organized. The first, so I have 7 criteria, and I think it's important to list them. The first is accessibility. Is the targeted text, the typos, available in the culture? And the most available text in the culture of the time, for Jews as well, is the Homeric epics. So, for example, we have almost 800 fragments of the Homeric epics in the time around the New Testament. and we have 5 attested to the Septuagint. Now, you tell me which is the more likely model. The second criterion is accessibility. Do we know that other authors targeted the same typos? Let's say, again, the shipwreck story. Then we have 3 categories that test the similarities between these stories. And these similarities are not lexical, but they have to do with themes or motifs. One is, are the themes or the motifs dense? Are there multiple examples of these motifs clustered? The fourth criterion is order. Do those motifs appear in a similar or rational sequence? The next is distinctive traits. Are the statements, these motifs, unusual so that you're not likely to find them elsewhere? And authors often use these unusual traits to flag the similarities that they're interested in establishing. That's the 5th criterion. The 6th one is interpretability. Why would an author go to imitate the topos? And this is where you get syncresis. Syncresis establishes the relationship of your hero to the hero in the Homeric epics, let's say. And the final criterion is, did people in the ancient world recognize these similarities, comment on them, or imitate them? And we have some cases where there can't be any doubt that these authors recognize the similarities between Jesus, let's say, and Odysseus or Hector. Now, there's this business about density of motifs has been fortified by what's called, in its larger definition, binomial distribution probability theory. And it's the statistical model or the equation that allows one to see with 2 different entities what are the probabilities of a connection between them. It's used in science, it's used in social science, it's almost never used in literature. But it allows one to see in, let's say, the Gospel of Mark, a series of motifs that are similar to the death of Hector. And you can quantify those and run the calculation. And the calculation is there's a 100% correlation between the 2. And that doesn't even account for the similarities in sequence or in theology. And you won't find this kind of analysis anywhere. And in this form, you won't find it even in my own books. So the introduction to this book is extremely important. Now, once one understands how mimesis and the paraphysis work in the use of texts, the synoptic problem falls into place. And there's no doubt about what the order is. There are differences with each other, are clarifications. And by the way, the very fact that we have multiple gospels indicates that they're imitating each other, but they're doing so often in a hostile way. So that feuding gospel authors, in a way, is a gospel disharmony. And it allows us, in fact, to see the historical Jesus more clearly, because we can use mimesis to strip away the mythological trappings that made Jesus into the Christian hero that he is in the New Testament. But Jesus was a radical Jew, and the Gospels are using the image of Jesus in order to establish their new religion and to make him into the Christ. So that's that's an overview of the book. Now, I probably can say a few other things. The authors that I treat are then the author of the Lost Gospel, whom I call Logographos, the author of Logos, of the Logoi. Then Mark, Matthew, Papias, Luke, even though it's a pseudonym, as are Mark and Matthew probably. But then I add Theophilus, the person to whom Luke dedicated his 2 volumes. I also talk about the Thomas Evangelist, 2 different authors related to the Gospel of John, Marcion, and I throw in Irenaeus at the end of the book, who is insisting that the Gospels are not feuding with each other. They're rather articulating different aspects of God's Logos, that is the Christ. So that's what this book is about, and they're arguing with each other quite strongly. Now, you might say, okay, MacDonald, this is all fiction. No, it's historical fiction. Yes, I'm writing things on behalf for them, but everything that I'm writing can be documented by a gospel synopsis, such as mine, Synopses of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels. My reconstruction of Q is available in several forms, including a recent book called Must the Synoptics Remain a Problem? An alternative reconstruction of Q and its use by the Synoptics. So I'm so excited about this book. And by the way, it's going to be my last one. Today is my 79th birthday, by the way. And I'm not planning to write another book, but I know that I'll have to answer to some of my critics. So I'll just be prepared to do that. And maybe some podcasts, because, Jacob, I so enjoy being on your camera and on your microphone. And you have such good questions to ask and a generous attitude toward scholarship. And I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Dennis. That means a lot. And happy birthday.
Thank you.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Were different Christian groups growing? I think you might just say, maybe we should remove the word getting. I would just say just growing bigger, stabilized, or declining when the last gospel was written. Is it possible the gospels are written for different groups because Paul and Jesus are at odds?
Well, let's not worry about Paul and Jesus. Let's talk about these Christian groups. The Christian groups are not homogeneous. The people that Mark is writing for are not exactly the ones that Matthew's writing for. And quite clearly, Luke is writing for a Gentile audience, and he is not writing for the same crowd that Mark is. Thomas is writing for a different crowd that valorizes only the special sayings that Jesus had given Thomas. So these groups are growing. By the way, you can tell something about the growth of the groups by the popularity of their gospels. And the one that is clearly the most popular was Matthew. We have more evidence of references to it. So, for example, the Goodacre talks about the gospel as a text, and Matthew's the only one that is quoted. So that would be an example. The next most popular one was John. And if one takes a look at Tertullian, Tertullian's concerned only about the Gospel of Matthew and John, and to some extent John. The other Gospels hardly get play unless it's in opposition, let's say, to Marcion, where Luke comes into play. So yes, these groups are growing. The Matthean group seems to be the strongest and the one that becomes most valorized later on. Luke was very important, but the Acts of the Apostles had very little traction in the early church. It was circulated with the Catholic epistles, for example, and separated from Luke. So these groups grew. By the way, they were relatively small. So we can't talk about these as huge populations that are converting. And that doesn't happen until about the 3rd century. But they are growing and they are multiplying in various areas. So, and by the way, these gospels were distributed in different locations. So the people who knew Matthew may not have known, people who lived in Egypt may not have known Matthew, let me put it that way. So they're growing exponentially, but they're still small. But they are growing and they are enjoying this literature. So these texts become, for various groups, founding myths. And this word myth is not the same as mythology. The issue is that they are trying to create narratives, fictional narratives, that explore the founding of their groups to give them inspiration for how to deal with things that, such as the Roman Empire or relationship to Judaism or poverty and so on. So your question's really very rich, and it would require more of a conversation. But these texts were important for the growth of these groups, and the difference, the reason, and this may be behind your question, the reason that we have differences among the Gospels isn't because we had different, one group outgrew the other and needed another text. These texts are created to establish social identity. And they establish social identity over against Judaism. They establish social identity over against each other. But the missing component has been they are also establishing social identity over against the Greco-Roman culture as represented in the Homeric mythology. So these are founding myths. And the reason I emphasize that, Jonathan, is the notion that the Gospels are wannabe histories is a modern judgment. These texts aren't written to be histories. They're theological treatises to give a vision of stability and value to various social groups. And that's why they differ from each other, because these social groups have different identities. The identity of the Matthean community is certainly Jewish. The one that Luke is addressing is certainly Greek or Roman.
Zealand Zen, thank you for your super chat. Is History Valley my favorite channel? Yes. Well, thank you, Zealand. That means a lot. Dr. Andy, thank you for your super chat. Happy birthday, Dennis. We all love you. You are such a great guy. Any ideas on how you want to spend the next 50 years?
Oh, my God. I don't want to spend 50 more years. I'll tell you one of the things, Dr. Andy, that I'm working on, and you might be able to see it in the picture in the background. I have banjos. I'm a serious banjo player. And I'm playing in several different groups. One's an Irish group, another is a gospel song group. Others are American songbook. In fact, I'm going to be playing my banjo tonight with the group. So that's what I want to do in my retirement. And by the way, one of the things, there's a relationship between playing a banjo, believe it or not. in the interpretation of the Gospels or the writing of the Gospels. That is, they're technical challenges that create something beautiful and meaningful. And I don't know, Dr. Andy, what your gifts are, but my attitude is not, life is not about obeying commandments. It's about creating beauty. And right now in our world, we don't have enough of it. We don't have enough of beautiful and meaningful music. We don't have enough meaningful literature that captures our imagination and keeps us from racism and sexism and homophobia. And you can tell I'm a liberal. But if I had 50 years to go, I would want to talk about this book that I'm working on and then play a lot of banjo and be a good grandpa.
Which gospel out of all the ones you talk about in this book do you think has the most in it on the feud? Like, in other words, which one of them would you say is feuding the most against the rest?
I think the one has to say that Mark is the one that is the biggest target. And it's a big target from many perspectives. One reason it's a target is that the author of the Logoi of Jesus think Mark has blown what Jesus's primary commitment was, and that is a reassessment of the Jewish law. That is not a big issue for Mark. For Mark, it's that Jesus is the Christ. He's the promised one, and he's going to be the glorious founder of a new religion. Matthew doesn't like Mark very much, even though he uses so much of it. You can see this in Mark is critical of the 12 disciples. Matthew reads that and he says, no, we can't have it that way. We've got to justify what Judas did by having him commit suicide. We have to justify, we have to forgive Peter for what he did in denying Jesus 3 times by making him the rock on which Jesus is going to build his church. And it goes on and on. He's trying to repair the publicity damage that Mark has done for the disciples. All the later Gospels have a problem with Mark's ending. And that's why you have the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark. Matthew takes a swipe at it. Luke takes a swipe at it. John takes a swipe at it. And you see some issue of it in the Gospel of Thomas, but it's not very clear. So Mark is really a radical document, and it is really full of imitations of the Homeric epics. And it also is very anti-Roman. And later on, well, Luke, for example, and to some extent John probably, are trying to make nice with the Roman Empire. Mark's radicalism, it has to be softened. And you can see this in Luke's Passion narrative, where Pilate 3 times declares Jesus to be innocent. And the centurion says Jesus was a just man. He was dikaios. Whereas in Mark, the centurion at the cross is chiding Jesus and says, oh yeah, this mortal was a son of a god. Now he's dead, duh. So that is a gloat. That is not a confession of faith. Matthew makes it into a confession of faith. So for example, so Mark is the one that catches the most action. And by the way, it's not by accident that that is also the gospel that is least used in the history of the church. You've got lots of people using Matthew and John. You have some using Luke. Mark is not very popular. In part, I think, because people couldn't recognize the Homeric imitations and appreciate them. But also, he was stepping on a lot of toes.
How would you look at the Gospel of John? I know you believe that the Gospel of John, and many other scholars do too, that John was written in stages. So how does the feud work with John's Gospel?
The three stages, in my view, and by the way, this is not just my position, begins with what I would call the Dionysian Gospel. This is where one finds the prologue, which is similar to the prologue of Dionysus at the beginning of the Bacchae. This is where Jesus's first miracle is turning water into wine for a bunch of drunks at a wedding. He also is the love God. He gives gift after gift. The Gospel of John, in its first form, in my view, was a supplement to Luke, and not a rival to it. And the reason that it was a supplement is that the author probably was aware of the popularity of Dionysian religion, where Dionysus was offering good sex, good wine, and eternal life because of its rites. If you look at the Synoptics, Jesus is saying, pick up your cross and follow me. Get rid of your goods and give to the poor. Jesus in the Synoptics is not showing people a good time. There is a promise of eternal life. But the author of the earliest Gospel of John, in my view, is trying to correct the perception that Jesus is only giving you a bad experience, and that his Jesus can compete with Dionysus in giving eternal life and a good time and gift after gift. You don't have to wait until you get to heaven to get benefits from John's Jesus. The second stage is the anti-Jewish gospel. And this is after the excommunication of Johannine Jews from the synagogue. And it's very painful. So now the problem with Judaism is not its rulers and not its chief priests at the temple. The big problem is the Jews themselves. Now Jews themselves are demonized. And this is one of the tragic moments of anti-Semitism in the New Testament, where former Jews are blaming Jews for being children of the devil and liars and murderers. It really is tragic. The third is the gospel of the beloved disciple. All references to the beloved disciple, that is the elder John, who had died by the time that this was put together. Every reference to him appears in this third version, and that includes the epilogue. And the epilogue is diplomatic, Jacob. It's trying to make nice. It begins with the story of a miraculous catch of fish that is similar to what happens at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. It then has Jesus asking Peter if he loves him, and Peter has a feeble answer, but even so, Jesus says, feed my sheep. He's going to be Jesus's shepherd after Jesus's death. The author of the beloved disciple gospel says, okay, we acknowledge Peter's authority over the flock. But I expect that, in fact, the heavens could not contain everything written about Jesus. And we like the one written by our beloved disciple. And so there you have a making nice not not primarily with Jews, but with other believers in Jesus, other followers, and a recognition of Peter's supremacy, which you have in Matthew, but also the pride in having their own gospel and not seeing it as a rival to other gospels. So that I think the Gospel of John is really quite amazing in allowing us to do this excavation of an early Christian community trying to make sense of who Jesus is going to be for them.
We got a super chat question from Zealand Zen. Thank you for your super chat. Mark's ending implied Jesus's deification.
Yes, I think the deification is a little tricky, isn't it, Zealand is. I would say Mark's ending implies surely Jesus's resurrection and vindication by God. Whether one would say it makes him equal to God or anything like the Trinity or not is more difficult. I would say that it makes him more like a Romulus, that is a glorified hero who establishes a dynasty of mortals and is worthy of veneration. But I don't know if I would call that deification, but certainly it's a glorification of Jesus to be competitive with the likes of Roman emperors, for example. And I think that that's the one that that's what Mark is trying to get to. After all, Mark, and before him, actually, the Q document says that the Holy Spirit came upon Jesus and he became the Son of God, and in an adoption, and that's how Octavius became Augustus, in an adoption by Julius Caesar. So I think deification isn't quite right unless we talk about the emperors as being deified, and of course they were. Yeah. So I guess you're right.
Adia Morgenstern, thank you for your super chat. Why is James not directly named in John?
Why is James? I don't know. By the way, the John of the Gospel of John is not the brother of James. So that would be a partial answer. Many people think the Gospel of John is identified with the disciple John. And in fact, that's how the church later interpreted it. But it's quite clear that the John who's mentioned there is not the brother of James. It's the beloved disciple that Papias talks about.
How is Marcion involved in the feud?
As you know, you've done as much work on this, Jacob, as I have. So I could turn the question around to you, but let me start. I have, in my epistles, I have Marcion and Theophilus exchanging letters. And Marcion admits to Papias, to Theophilus, that he truncated Luke's gospel, and that he did so primarily to be able to have a smaller New Testament, and to have it circulate together, not with the Acts of the Apostles, but with the truncated version of Paul's letters called the Apostolicon, to be volume 2, with his Evangelion, his gospel. And Marcion is trying to say, I think that Luke ought to be happy that I truncated what he wrote. I got rid of his anti-Roman stuff. I got rid of his business about the fall of Jerusalem. I tidied up his stories so that they're not so garrulous. I got rid of a lot of verbiage that you have in Paul. And I put together this smaller, compact version of the New Testament, but there was no such thing at the time, but of Christian texts, so that we could distribute them, and to challenge not just Judaism, but also other forms of Christian experience, namely the Orthodoxy. So Marcion has a theological, in my letter to Theophilus, Marcion says, I have a different theological project and a different publishing project to make things briefer and to make them possibly cohering into a single codex. And I can use my wealth as a shipbuilder to distribute them. Theophilus comes back and says, Luke would have been outraged at what you did, because gone now are the things that are related to Judaism that are worth keeping. You don't say anything about the fall of the temple. You don't, and from my perspective, you just took Mark's story, Luke's stories about Jesus, and that are based on Greek mythology, and you got rid of all the mythological stuff that makes them most interesting. The only virtue, says Theophilus, that I can see in what you did is that you preserved a lot of Jesus's teachings that were there in Luke, and Luke was the one who preserved the Q document most, the Log of Jesus most carefully. So some people can say that your gospel is more primitive, let's say, than Matthew, but the reason that it is more primitive is because Luke was more primitive than Matthew in preserving the Q document. So here you see how mimesis and the Q document conspire to make sense of the synoptic problem.
We got a super chat from Constellation Pegasus. Thank you for your super chat. What is going on with the number 40 in the Gospels? The planet Venus is a 40-year cycle. I suspect with my limited knowledge, Chaldean magic is involved somehow, like Leviathan, a tradition they never completely got rid of.
Whoa, you're way ahead of me on this one. I didn't know that about Venus. And I do know that for a long, not just the Chaldeans, but also the Greeks were very interested in astrology and astronomy. And so I wouldn't be surprised that Pythagoreans, for example, had such an interest as well. Certainly Plato does. And you can see it in the Timaeus all over the place. So I wouldn't be surprised that that 40 is a significant number in mythology. I understand also that the ancients thought that 40 years was the extent at which someone would die if they didn't eat, and therefore Moses is being on the mountain for 40 days without eating is remarkable. Jesus is being in the wilderness for 40 days is almost unheard of, because no one can survive for 40 days without eating. And certainly people would become hungry, and that's why the devil was able to tempt Jesus to take some bread, because he was on death's door. I certainly, for 40 is not a part of the lunar cycle. So your business about Venus may may add some luster to it. It'd be interesting to know in Chaldean poetry if you have 40 that is important. But the number 40 does occur frequently in these texts, and it must have some symbolic meaning. And the one that I was attracted to was the business about not being able to survive not eating for 40 days.
What's the one thing that, if there was anything, if you could point to one thing that you might have figured out when you were writing the Feuding Gospels, what would you name that one thing?
This is going to be difficult to talk about because it's a story that almost nobody knows. And it goes like this. Paul is in Ephesus, and there are 7 exorcists who are claiming that they can cast out demons by the name of Jesus. And all 7 of these exorcists are children of a chief priest, that is, someone from Judea, whose name is Scevos. Scevos is not a Hebrew name. It's not an Aramaic name. It's not a Greek name. It's a Latin nickname, and it means lefty. It's a nickname, and Scevos himself doesn't have any role. Now, when these exorcists try to cast out a particularly pernicious demon, they say, "Who are you?" We know about Paul, we know about Jesus, but you're powerless. And they beat him. The demon beats up the 7 exorcists and sends them off naked and wounded. This is the story that appears in the Iliad and has an imitation in Virgil's Aeneid. It goes like this. Achilles is joining the war, and he has a glowing head, and he single-handedly is showing his power just before attacking Troy, single-handedly, and then killing Hector. Along the way, he runs into a fellow named Asteropaeus, who's a Paeolian, and that is, he's an ally of the Trojans. And this Asteropaeus is ambidextrous. That word appears in Greek in the Iliad. So here you have a lefty, and then you have this fellow who's ambidextrous. Now Achilles finds this guy. He says, "I don't know. I've heard about Hector. I've heard about Aeneas. I don't know who you are, you numbskull. And people like you are going to be sad and sadden their parents because I'm going to kill you." And he said, well, Asteropaeus then says, "But I come from noble lineage. I'm the scion of a series of rivers, divine rivers." And remember, Scevos is a chief priest, so he gives his children this high pedigree of faithful Jews. And so you have this question. So who are you? Then Achilles kills Asteropaeus. And then what does he do? He kills 7 of Asteropaeus's fellows, and he strips them of their clothing, and he throws them into the river. And of course, well, not of course. After killing Asteropaeus, the river's commander, is outraged and raises his waves to fight Achilles, and Achilles almost dies. Here's a mortal fighting an immortal river. And it's only when Hera tells Hephaestus to throw down fire to fight back against the river that Achilles is spared. But it shows how powerful he is. In this story, in the Acts of the Apostles, what happens after the killing, the trouncing of the 7 sons of Scevos? The magicians in Ephesus burn their books, and you have fire that there is there. And the last verse in this story says, and people were amazed at the Lord's power. The issue is a way of establishing power. Now, I ran those common motifs through the binomial system, and the result is a 99% affinity, a correlation between those stories. I was totally blown away by this. And then I remembered that in the Acts of Andrew, Andrew does the same thing. And not because he saw it in Acts, but because he saw it in the Iliad. Namely, Andrew creates a flood that floods all of the place of Myrmidonia. Achilles was the king of the Myrmidonians. He then dismisses and puts to flight the devil and 7 demons. And then to circle the flood, he calls down heavenly fire. Now, you can't have those similarities in those motifs in the similar order by accident. So it shows that Christians were happy to imitate the Iliad. And I discovered that those parallels, honestly, just in the last few months. I'm sure there are more things like that to still be discovered. But unless you're attentive to the methodology, you'll miss it. You'll read it and you say, oh, it's just, it's a similar motif. It's in the air. It's what, this is how people talked about the power in antiquity and so on. No, this is literary mimesis. And it shows that Andrew has the power of God the same way that Achilles had the power of his patron deities. You're muted, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you. So before we close, can you tell everybody when your book is coming out and where they can go purchase it?
Well, it's ready to go. I have the index done. I'm having one more read through to read it as though I'd never seen it before, so that I'm playing the role of most readers. My daughter is returning from Japan tomorrow, and it has promised to reread the introduction, where I have this methodological discussion of ancient rhetoric and mimesis and paraphrassis and so on. So I'm hoping to have it released in the next 2 weeks. I had wanted to release it before my birthday, to be honest with you, but that's not going to happen.
Well, when it comes out, I'll have the link in the description below in the pinned comment. I'll also have the link to Dennis's other books down there as well. That being said, Dennis, thank you for joining me today, and again, happy birthday.
Thank you, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.